And I'm going to mention this. I'm super excited about today's episode. For those who know me, I tend to love going back to look at how particular, I don't know, libraries or maybe early browser stages, what it was like then and compare in comparison to today. And today's episode is going to be something along those lines. So that being said, I'm going to prepare myself and get my guests ready. And three, two, one, boom. And here he is, Monsieur Philippe Tellis. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Henri, for having me on again.
I know, right? I'm having you for a second time, but it feels like it could be, I don't know, it could have been three. I think we are going to have a fantastic conversation. And for those who are curious, Philip joined us, uh, God, about 6 or 7 episodes ago, along with God, Mr.
Cliff Crocker and Caroline.
Crocker and Caroline from the W3C Rum community group. I was going to say working group. I just wanted to make sure I didn't have to correct myself. But that was a great conversation. But this one's going to be separate from that. But the connecting theme is going to be RUM, real user monitoring, as we like to call it. But before we get to that, and for those who didn't watch that episode, which again, I'll maybe find the link and post it in the chat. But Monsieur Tellis, would you please introduce yourself, talk about who you are, where you've work currently, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, hey. So, my name is Philip. I'm Blues Moon on all of the socials. I do not actually check Twitter anymore, so don't message me there. But yeah, Blue Sky, LinkedIn, that's Blues Moon, and probably a few other places as well. I currently work at Akamai, and prior to that, we came into Akamai through an acquisition. So it was at Sosta, and prior to that, Log Normal. Essentially, throughout this time, I've been working on the same project. So it's kind of odd that I've been through 4 companies, Yahoo before that, and I have worked on exactly the same code base for all of them. I think I really started my career a long time ago. So in the late 90s is when I started professionally working with computers, and prior to that was doing a lot of ad hoc pro bono work for anybody who wanted it. So, but yeah, I kind of got onto the web fairly early. I think 1996 is when I really started doing my web development and learned CSS by looking at the source code of Hotmail.
Wow.
I had a Hotmail email address. Yeah. Interestingly, I had Philip T at Hotmail. I don't have that anymore. I can't log into Hotmail. But so those were fun days, learning to use the web by really just reading the source code in Internet Explorer 2.0, I think, and making changes, seeing how that worked for myself. The browser wars were very interesting at that point of time, making layouts using tables, nested in tables. So if you didn't live through that, consider yourself lucky. But I think a lot of that, I eventually got into Yahoo, I was working on an open source Yahoo Messenger clone. And that's kind of how I got in touch with a lot of people at Yahoo, and eventually they asked me to come and join them. And that's kind of where I got into web performance. So I was not involved in web performance prior to that. I was definitely interested in the web and more security related, but performance became more of a key point at Yahoo.
Okay. And that's awesome, by the way. And again, this is exactly what I thought we would sort of hear, and it's not often that you get to sort of like speak to, individuals who have a rich history of watching the web grow. Many who have, still have gainful employment. They're working at their company, whatever it is, and they go home and that's it. And sometimes you don't even know who they are, so you don't know who to ask for, but I know that you sort of like been active, kind of pop up here and there, and still, like we mentioned, the community group that you're a part of, with a few others. So it's always interesting when we are able to like speak someone to someone like yourself who, having started around 96 and saw many things. You just mentioned the browser wars. A lot of people don't realize that, there was a browser war. They might say like, "What's that?" You know, and there was a moment where things were a little crazy. And I read about a bunch of it, watched videos and things like that. So, anyways, I don't want to sort of like make that about my commentary. So you joined at some point Yahoo. When you joined, you said you discovered performance, but were you initially part of this, mythic Yahoo performance team or performance, whatever they called it?
No, it's yeah, it's the performance team didn't exist back then. So I
Mhm.
joined Yahoo in 2004, and my work was mainly around the back end of the communication system. So message boards, blogs, ratings and reviews, those kinds of things, working on the back end for that. And I didn't touch the front end at all for several years. The closest I got was writing PHP extensions for people who would then use our code in PHP, but I didn't actually write front end code. Around the same time, I think might have been late 2003 or 2004 when Steve started working on a round trip. So round trip was the precursor to Boomerang, and that just essentially attached to the onload handler page, and add, as well as the unload handler of and using a cookie figured out the difference between the start time and the end time of page load. And that was all it did. It measured that and sent one data point back to to Yahoo servers. And this started getting more and more interesting. So around 2005 or so, it became more well known across Yahoo, and there were all these different, let's say, mailing lists and chat rooms. We were all on IRC. Yahoo had its internal IRC server, so we had develop performance and develop front end, and these huge communities of people across the world talking about single topics. And that's where the performance culture really started growing up within these small circles. I think the performance group was at that time was just Steve, and then he pulled in a few other people to join his team. I was more as an outsider, sort of looking in, contributing to the ideas there. And then in about 2007, Steve asked if I'd be interested in joining the team. So I was based in Bangalore, and the team was based in California. So I started preparation to move to California. And about a week before I actually moved, Steve announced that he was leaving Yahoo. So I joined the team when Steve had already moved out. But that was interesting in a way. I got to take over a lot of the code and work on it. So over the years, I don't know. Maybe we should switch to the timeline that I've written. But
So let's before we touch the timeline, because you've mentioned so much that we could talk about, like from even Steve Souders being there, and whatnot. And I know the timeline is really going to sort of like allow us to dig into some other areas of your career as well, because I think there's very obvious overlap. But I'm gonna again ask the classic question that I've asked everyone who's been a guest here. What is their first memory of working on performance?
yeah, I'd say my first memory is probably just since I didn't work too much on the front end, it was more really talking to people and working on hacks within Yahoo. So Yahoo had, I think, a quarterly hack day internally where you could work on anything to improve any part of Yahoo. And that's where I started looking into performance really and saying, okay, how can I actually make things faster, make things smoother, and switching from a multi-page app to which did large reloads to just doing small events and using Ajax and stuff. Those were kind of the start of it, to make the user interface feel more snappy
Mhm.
rather than uh, thinking in terms of time to load and stuff. We were just thinking about how can we make things more smooth, and that was my introduction to performance. And like I said, we had these huge support groups. The YUI team, for example, they were always around to help anybody who had questions about, how do I make this faster, or why is this sluggish, why is this taking up so much CPU time? And you could get really fine-grained, like, this particular code doesn't work for me on Firefox 1.0 something running on FreeBSD 4, and they would help you dig into it and find these issues. So it was that combination of just curiosity, being able to work across the stack, and having people around that really supported and could help you find problems. I think-
And, there's so much that you mentioned even within that sentence right there. You mentioned YUI. And for those who aren't familiar, that's the Yahoo user interaction or something like that.
Face library.
Exactly, exactly. And I remember, again, just reading about these things. Um, and again, the idea that mentioning how browsers uh, and their support or lack of support made things that much more challenging, I think, is also part of the story. But we'll get to that in a hot second. So let's put up this chart that or these slides that you'd mentioned that you prepared, which are actually going to also help us sort of like guide us through a historical look at Boomerang. Okay, so now we have this pretty set of slides that you created for us, and walks us through a historical look at or chronological look at Boomerang, essentially. Because, folks, this is what we want to talk about today. Boomerang is a library that has really just allowed for RUM and RUM data. And we're going to see, even though there's been a lot more conversation about RUM in the last, say, like, we'll say a couple of years at least, uh, it has been around for much longer than that. And people like Philip have been championing the idea of RUM, which, I'll be very honest, I didn't understand very well because I don't think I had a lot of documentation on it early. Like all these books that I kept reading, O'Reilly books, it would be like it wasn't really rum related. It was like front end. It was like, hey, what's going on, et cetera, et cetera. Anyhow, that's enough about that. Let's walk through this. So your first little bit here is that Steve creates round trip.
Yeah, so this was, I think, around, and this was before I joined Yahoo, probably a few months prior to my joining Yahoo. That Steve created Round Trip, and the idea was we'd measure the performance of pages from the user's perspective, right?
Mhm.
This was a revolutionary idea at the time, because everybody else was using tools like Keynote or Gomez that had server-side agents, and that would ping your site and measure the latency from the server side. It really ignored completely the time it took the browser to render the page. It ignored asset download and all of that. It just told you how long it took for the server to respond with HTML.
Mhm.
And
Now, hold that thought for a second and tell everyone who Steve is.
all right, so Steve Souders is generally considered either the grandfather or the godfather of web performance. He kind of, with this move in 2003, 2004, created the whole real user monitoring and web performance space. He founded the exceptional performance team at Yahoo, which many people consider to be the one of the first performance teams that really publicly spoke about performance and the need to improve performance. He found that, you know, through writing Round Trip, that 80% of page load of the user experience time, rather, is on the front end. And that's largely because we'd focused so much on back-end performance with the decades prior to that, that it had been optimized to the point of it was already very fast. So really, most of the slowness was in the front end for various reasons. People not understanding how the browsers worked, or the browsers themselves doing different things. Again, different browsers working differently makes it very hard for a web developer to build a site that works efficiently across all of them.
Yeah.
So Steve Souders was one of the people who figured these things out by working on performance. At the time, it was a one-person team, and really the team grew from there. I think there was good executive support. So Ash Patel, who's vice president, I think, and probably even David Philo, one of the co-founders at Yahoo, um, were very supportive of this and sort of made it a de facto tool for teams at Yahoo to use. So they kind of could keep using Gomez and Keynote, but they also had to pay attention to their round trip time and the actual user experience time rather than just server side time.
Yeah. And, I'll let you go in 1 second. I just want to remind everyone, if you go back and watch the episode with Tammy Everts, and she talked about joining, I don't know, it was Tammy at Sosta?
Yes, Tammy was at Sosta. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe it was Sosta, or maybe someone in between Sosta and wherever she went. But at one point, she talked about joining a company, and they had created a product that was basically called Souders in a Box. And that's essentially what she's referring to, which is Steve Souders and his work. That was just basically like this plug and play
Was the
product.
affiliated with here? I think was she at Radweb?
Maybe it was Radware, I think. Yeah, yeah. But I just remember when she said Souders in a Box, and I just started like chuckling because it made sense, right? So you sort of contribute to that story by mentioning who Souders was. Okay, I'll let you go.
Yeah, and so a lot of this research, so in 2004 we created Roundtrip, and in 2005 we kind of decided you needed to not just measure the round trip time, but also break that down by different user types. So we're looking at different browsers, different geos, but also we wanted to know what bandwidth people were seeing when they use the web. Or we call it bandwidth, but in truth it was network throughput. So there was a new piece of code added to Roundtrip that measured the bandwidth of a user's network connection by basically trying to download an image and seeing how long it took that image to download, and then doing this bytes divided by time, figuring out that's the number of kilobits per second you get. And it was pretty rudimentary. But it evolved over time, and in fact started taking care of things like TCP slow start, which it's not so much an issue now. But one of the reasons we don't have an issue now is because we discovered back then that TCP slow start was affecting the web. So for those who don't know, back in the day when you started a TCP connection, you would have to send an acknowledgement for every packet received, and then as the client and server kind of agreed on the fact that this connection was not lossy, it would increase the number of packets you could send before an acknowledgement was required. So that's what's called slow start, is you start slow and then you keep increasing the throughput until you get to a stable state. Starting with one packet was pretty bad. That's about 1,500 bytes per packet before you have to send an acknowledgement. So you're waiting kind of 100 to 300 milliseconds after every 1,500 bytes before you can send the next set of 1,500 bytes. Once we figure that out through things like this testing, we lobbied people to increase the default window size to 10. So now you could send 15 kilobytes rather than 1,500 bytes, and that made a bit of a difference. So most CDNs and operating systems improved their own window sizes at that point. Going forward, around 2006 is actually when the W3C's web timing spec came out. If the web timing spec doesn't exist anymore, it's now it got renamed to the navigation timing spec, and now it's all of the different performance timing specs together. Back then, it was just called web timing. There were no browsers that actually implemented it in 2006, but the spec kind of existed. It was a fairly raw idea of how we should measure performance without impacting the user experience. So as we go forward, in about 2009, uh, I was kind of the lead on the project, and I started talking to Yahoo about open sourcing Boomerang, mainly because we noticed that there weren't really any other libraries outside. There was probably one other company called WebTuna, Tuna.
Okay.
I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but they initially started off doing something called Java Tuna, and it was essentially to measure performance. But they did things very interestingly, like instrumenting every link on the page, and essentially it took something like 10 seconds to bootstrap before it could start measuring. Uh, we definitely knew our product was better at that point, so I was lobbying Yahoo to open source it. And Yahoo had an open source legal group that would guide people through open sourcing. So we went through some of the recommendations, and they said, really, we don't know who's written code for round trip. Because it had been written by so many people over so many years, and we don't know who owns the copyright and whether people are still at Yahoo or not. So I said, if you can rewrite it, we might be able to open source it. So that's where Boomerang started out. And it gave me a kind of a good starting point to re-architect it. Boomerang, or rather Roundtrip, had been created in 2004 using the APIs that were state of the art at that point. By 2009, things were very different. You no longer had to attach something to window.onload. You could use something like add event listener, which did not exist in 2004. So we had better ways of event handling, better ways of identifying when a user interacted with the page. So the on unload and the on before unload events existed. You could also track clicks on the page itself. So there were a lot of new features available on the web. So we started re-architecting this. And the idea at that point kind of changed from just measuring performance to why not build something that's just a beaconing system? So that's what Boomerang is at its core. It's all it does is sends a beacon back to a server, and it has many different ways of sending a beacon because different browsers do different things. How you send a beacon depends on how large that beacon is, on whether you're in a single page app, on whether you're iframed or not. So there's lots of different things that are required. And so Boomerang became just this beaconing system. And then the beacon would be enriched with plugins.
Yeah. So hold that thought for a second. So now, and this is perfect because I was always wondering, like when you'd mentioned to me round trip a while back, and I completely forgot, and I'm like, oh my god, round trip, that's totally true. So essentially, boomerang or round trip sort of became boomerang for a couple reasons. One is that there were so many contributors to round trip, and that group had scattered so much and no one knew who had like any kind of ownership. It was an opportunity to sort of, as you said, re-architect what was once boomerang to no, what was once round trip to something new, which is boomerang.
Right.
And boomerang was also possible as a new product, well, a new idea, because a lot had changed in 4 to 5 years from like browsers. And I'm assuming as well, sort of like you got started in 96. And at that point, I think JavaScript had been moving along as well. And I'm
Yep.
assuming a lot changed there. That was also going to allow for you to make Boomerang what it sort of became eventually, or at least to start it fresh and new.
Yeah, yep, exactly. So for example, and this is going to sound dated for now, but we no longer had to support IE 2 and 3. We could,
It's like
we could,
people are like, what?
we could say, let's support just IE 5.5 and higher.
Right.
And of course, today we don't support any version of IE actually. But that was the thinking at the time. We could drop features that were built for these older browsers that really didn't exist. I think I received, when I brought up the system we received one beacon from Internet Explorer 5.5 on Mac OS Gold or something, which was a version of IE only written for Mac OS.
I remember, and that might have been me.
So that was the only beacon we ever saw from that version of the browser. So we decided, yeah, it made sense to only support grade A and V browsers. YUI had published browser classes, and grade A are the ones that would receive top tier support, and grade B should work. And there were
Mhm.
other types of browsers that were either too old or too new that you didn't need to support. And
So
so,
I'm going to interrupt real quick again, and I'm sorry because I'm going to ask you grade A, grade B. Um, where was Netscape?
let me think now. At 2009, so Netscape probably had moved out at that time, and
Mm,
Netscape had been rebranded to what was Phoenix, which then became Fire. Uh,
Fox. Oh no,
well,
Firebird or something.
Firebird, and then Firefox, all because of naming conventions, and Firefox eventually. So that we had Firefox at that point of time, and eventually that became Mozilla. Uh, just sort of going back to their roots.
Yeah.
But yeah, Netscape would have probably been in the grade C browsers by then. And I also say the grade B browsers was then renamed to grade X to just say that those might include browsers that we don't know about yet.
Hmm.
So that's probably where Mozilla and some of the new versions of Firefox came in. Firefox also had Firebug, which was this cool new uh, developer tool that allowed you to actually inspect JavaScript and set breakpoints and stuff, which was amazing at the time. We nobody had seen it before. That also allowed for development of things like YSlow, which was kind of the browser plugin version of Roundtrip.
Yeah. And you mentioned Firebug. Oh, I was just going to say something. Oh, considered potentially the original dev tools,
Yep, exactly.
so
It,
anyway,
it it took us
let me,
beyond console. Well, we didn't have console right. We had to document that right to like a hidden div or something before that.
right. Okay, I'll let you carry on because I'll stop you every time.
Yeah. So I'd say that the name wasn't originally Boomerang. At that point of time, 2009 and into 2010, we didn't have a name. We were just calling it Round Trip and working on it eternally. We had to come up with a name when we registered the GitHub repository. And I was calling it Meerkat at the time because a meerkat pops out of its hole, looks around, and pops back in every now and then. But I kept mispronouncing it as Meekrat. So I asked around for suggestions, and Tom Croucher suggested a boomerang because it goes out and comes back in.
Yeah.
What's exactly what a beaconing system does. So it came up. We named it Boomerang. Well,
Nice.
before the public release in Velocity, I was also doing a lot of testing, and especially around the bandwidth images. No, I didn't have enough devices. I had my own device, which was a Nokia E71, I think. And
Ooh.
there were enough bugs on that. It had a very strange operating system and browser, but I think it was an Apple WebKit based browser. But
The OS wasn't it like Symbian?
yeah, Symbian, I forget the version, but
Like there was like Symbian 30 and Symbian 60, I think.
yes, exactly. And so the cool thing was we as soon as anyone with a new browser would visit, we'd see that data and we'd see exactly what data was coming through and what was not. And so I was getting impatient, waiting for people to hit me with different devices. So I biked down to the AT&T store on El Camino and Grant, and I went to every single device they had on the shop floor, and I opened the bandwidth test page, and I just let it run. Uh, so and then went back home and checked the logs because we started getting beacons from all of these browsers running on all of these devices,
Amazing.
the error logs and stuff to kind of debug issues as quickly as I possibly could. Yeah, we found a lot of bugs. For example, that particular Nokia phone does not fire any events when you load an image that has 0 bytes. Will have no response. There are no events fired, which was odd. All other browsers fire an on error event. But those were interesting times. I'd say that browser no longer exists. That phone no longer exists.
Yeah.
Um,
Sadly.
no, we moved. I think from there, mobile kind of moved to just these two different platforms, right? Android and iOS, and which kind of made it easier to test and debug. But there were still a large number of variants of Android around. I'd say it's the landscape's become easier to work with, but it's not definitely not simple. So when we did release it at Velocity, I think it was maybe the day off or the day before we were releasing it, and Internet Explorer announced that they were adding support for web timing API. So I think a few hours before my talk, I added web timing support into Boomerang. And so when we did make it was public with support for web timing from Internet Explorer. So that's something you'd never hear is Internet Explorer was the first to support a public spec, but
Amazing.
they were, and Chrome announced their intent to ship pretty soon after that.
I mean, so this is 2010 public
2010 June.
release at Velocity, and
Yeah.
this was Velocity in what was that?
Santa Clara.
Yeah,
Santa.
that's I was trying to remember like where it was. I was like Santa Ana, no. So interesting. So it's 2010. They release the first to support the API. Chrome is 2 years old at that point because I think they were released around 2008.
Yeah.
So very green. And I was going to mention something else about Internet Explorer that I remembered. I can't remember. Oh, here's a question because it's 2010. You're talking about having gone to stores to check, um, to set all these phones to the test page and running back and looking at the data. So it's 2010. The iPhone's been out 3 years.
Yeah.
What is it like testing on the iPhone at that point?
Yeah. So the iPhones were never up for store models for testing. So I'd have to rely on friends. I'd basically go around and ask people to, hey, hit my site on the iPhone. And I'd say things worked better on an iPhone than a Nokia.
Certainly. I mean, speaking of, Steve, oh my God, uh, but I mean, Apple, Steve, why am I losing myself? Apple CEO.
Oh, yeah. Steve Jobs.
Yeah, Jobs. Oh my God, I completely blanked out. Jobs used to brag about how the Safari was, based on standards, HTML5, yada, 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 yada. So I was kind of curious what that translate to when you were trying to test on those devices.
Yeah, so definitely the JavaScript model was much better, more stable. We could use event handlers that actually worked.
Mhm.
Uh, so again, if you weren't there at that time, there were uh, three ways of attaching events to handlers depending on which browser you were in. There was the add event listener, which is the W3C spec, and which Safari actually supported, and eventually Internet Explorer supported. There was window.attach event, which I think was the old Internet Explorer way of doing things. And then there was just the window.onload is equal to a function. And if you did the last one, you'd basically get rid of any of the other event handlers that were attached. So it was, I think, with the dawn of the iPhone and Safari and Chrome coming along at that point, we were seeing the end of all of these incompatible ways of doing event handling in the browser. And that I feel was a big move forward. It definitely made the code simpler. We could get rid of all of this old code, reduce the code size, actually have our entire Boomerang uh, payload deployed in a single TCP window, which
Oh,
was like
wow.
gold star at that point. can you
Yes.
get it into under 15 kilobytes so that you can deliver it in one round trip? And that
Yeah.
was it was made possible by getting rid of all these old APIs.
So basically, prior to that, you were forced to go through a few round trips, literally.
Yeah, yeah. There was a combination between the fact that the round trip itself was one packet before it
Mhm.
moved up, and the fact that we had more code in there just to support
Mm.
browser tabs.
Wow. Okay, I'll let you go.
Yeah. So I think just soon after Velocity, it might have been through a discussion at Velocity, the WebPerf working group was formally founded in 2010, I think in August 2010 at that point. And the chart has been updated every couple of years since then. In 2011, I think we added a full navigation timing plugin. So the navigation timing I added in 2010, since I only had about an hour to add it, was just a better way of determining the start and end time of page load.
Mhm.
But the full thing in terms of like getting your DNS time and TCP time and TLS time and all of that really made it into Boomerang in 2011 once both Chrome and Internet Explorer had it at that point of time. And those were only the only browsers that had it. Chrome also introduced pre-render at that time. I'd say pre-render version 1, maybe, where they pre-render a page. That didn't last long, but it was long enough for us to add support for it and kind of see what pages were doing, or what site owners were doing pre-render. And Buddy Brewer, who was my partner at LogNormal, so I should say, around this time I quit Yahoo and started LogNormal with Buddy, and he invented this thing called LD50, which is a term from the biological sciences. It's the
Yeah.
median lethal dose. Yeah, and
Which was an interesting name, by the way. I was like, what? How did that come into the
yeah,
conversation?
not familiar with the term. It's the dosage of a toxin that kills off 50% of a subject, typically cancer cells, but could also be mice. And in the case of web performance, it's what performance do you need to get, or what performance will drive away 50% of your users, or cause a bounce rate of 50%. And so that was interesting. We started correlating business metrics with performance data. Was kind of new at the time. Prior to that, we were always looking at single page loads, right? How long did it take a page to load, and was that fast enough? But the definition of fast enough makes no sense without a user. Right? Different users have different expectations of what fast enough is. And once we started correlating with business metrics and looking at the LD50 for people from different parts of the world, we found that it's definitely cultural. And there are people who've grown up with fast internet connections and they expect things to be very fast. And there are people whose internet connections haven't been as fast over the years. And so they tend to be more tolerant of slow or uh, laggy connections. And uh, that means you know, you have an opportunity to raise the bar at certain places, and it's going to be harder to raise the bar at other places
Mhm.
based on the reality at that space. And we can only look at that when we start looking at more than one page within a session, like what was an individual user's entire experience, which then brought in other things like how do we make sure that we're protecting the user's privacy while still tracking them across multiple pages, right? We didn't want to be tracking people. We didn't want to be in the business of tracking users. We wanted to be in the business of tracking network connections and network timing. So it was a conscious effort at that point of time to say if we set cookies, which was the only way to do this at the time, we're going to do it on a first party domain. That makes it impossible for us to track users across multiple domains. So
Mhm.
if a user jumps from site A to site B, they always look as a new user to us. And we're only going to hold that session for as long as they're on the page. For if they're inactive for 30 minutes, we basically throw away the cookie. So we did a bunch of things then to just make sure that we couldn't do it, and if our data ever got acquired by someone else, that they could not do it either. So those were some of the important things to us as a company at Love Normal. Around the same time in 2012, Safari introduced page show and page hide, which you may know of it as the events used for BF Cache today. So this was an early version of BF Cache. Where these events would fire instead of onload and on unload to say that something has been written to cache rather than being unloaded, or has been read from cache rather than being loaded. So we started using those events whenever they were available instead of the load and on unload. And another interesting thing we noticed at this point is the delta between the before unload and the page hide is basically the same as time to first byte. That's this was true at that point of time. So it was interesting that you could use these little proxies on Safari, which didn't support the navigation timing API, to figure out what the time to first byte was. Essentially, your response start from navigation timing is the same as the delta between page hide and on before unload. So all kind of fun insights from back then, which we no longer need now because we do have navigation timing everywhere.
Right, right.
And I think around this time, I forget whether, I think Chrome started playing around with SPDY, which was a precursor to HTTP2. And so you could tell from browser APIs whether a connection was over SPDY or just over HTTP1. And so we started tracking that. And Internet Explorer, I think, started publishing first paint time. So that was our introduction to paint timing. It was just first paint. There was no formal definition for it. So different browsers, I think Chrome added it as well. And it meant different things in different browsers. But it was interesting to just collect that data and see how it differed. It was not actionable at the time because as we've come to learn, just making the page blank, for example, would count as a first paint. And there are many heuristics nowadays to decide what is actually a first paint versus a first contentful paint.
Yeah. I remember the first paint. It was, if I'm not mistaken, it was the first non-white speck to show up on the screen.
Exactly. So if you had like anything, a little 1x1 pixel showed on screen, that was the first paint.
Exactly. I remember that. Ironically, I was just going through some old stuff recently, and I remember, and I'm sure you do as well, there was first paint, first content, there was first meaningful paint, which was like
meaningful paint, which never really became a browser spec. It was more of a synthetic spec, right? Because the definition of meaningful is different for everyone.
Totally, exactly. So that just came up in my some of my old sort of, my travels looking at old stuff. Anyhow, I just want to keep you going.
Yeah. So in 2013, resource forget it. This is when we added resource timing. So resource timing had been around for a little while at that time, but this is when we really added the resource timing. I think what we'd been waiting for is a way to efficiently send resource timing back to the server. Yeah, resource timing can be pretty big, right? You have 150 or so resources on a page, and each of them has a URL and a bunch of timings. So at the time, we were part of SOSTA, and I think it was at Velocity 2012 or 2013 when someone at Akamai presented on a way to compress resource timing data when sending it back to the browser using a try. And so that seemed pretty cool. We looked into implementing it ourselves and kind of got that implemented so we could send resource timing back in a compressed fashion. And adding resource timing then also opened the doors for adding single page app support. So this kind of happened in, I think we were at Velocity 2014 in Barcelona, I think. And Buddy and I were speaking on stage about measuring single page apps. We're just instrumenting the XHR call, and we just get a round trip time of how long it took the XHR to load. But we put up this big caveat saying it's only the network time, and we don't know exactly what else was loaded on the page. And someone from the audience asked, can you use a mutation observer to figure out if something's happening on the page? And so that night, I basically sat down and researched mutation observers and figured out that yes, we could in fact do a bunch of things with mutation observers, but there were some performance caveats around it, so there was a lot of testing involved. But in 2014, we did finally get using mutation observers measure full single page uploads and using resource timing as a proxy for navigation timing for those particular events. So that was pretty interesting. I think at that time, this was way before native sparse support in browsers, which is more in the last couple of years.
You'd mentioned that the mutation observer, when you made that discovery, that you could use it, but it wasn't uh, perfect. Now,
Yeah.
is this along the lines of when, because this is something that also comes up just in general, you might be using, say, I don't know, a plugin or a library, whatever it is. Was it sort of like interfering with performance in general?
Yeah, so there are various things with mutation observers depending on what you listen for and which object you put the mutation observer on. So in order to look for any changes in the page, you do have to listen to the entire page for mutations.
Mhm.
So the trick is to disconnect it as soon as you possibly can, and then not look at anything else. But also look for other things. So we don't rely completely on mutation observer. You also look at resource timing. You look at XHRs. You look at images that were added to the page, and to see if any of these things have happened. Then we can stop the mutation observer and just look for events. So when does the XHR complete? When does an image load complete? And those give us more of an idea of objects that have been downloaded and that are going to affect that page. Oops. Soon after that, this was kind of still at Sosta. I don't know if I mentioned, but we were acquired. Lognoll was acquired by Sosta in 2012, and most of this work happened then. So we had a much bigger team, but then Nick Jansma had joined the team, and a bunch of other folks from Sosta were working on it. We started measuring JavaScript errors, um, primarily because we wanted to know what errors Boomerang was causing on the page and fix them before our customers notice them. So, but it had the side effect of also being able to collect all the errors that were caused on the page. So the initial implementation was very simple. It would just limit it to errors caused by Boomerang and send that back to us on a different endpoint that will let us fix those errors quickly. But uh, quickly saw the value in collecting errors for our customers itself and giving them insights into that. And so we collected JavaScript errors. And I think there's a whole separate talk on JavaScript errors because different browsers have different messages for the same error. But
Okay.
that's not the fun part. The fun part is Internet Explorer has localized versions of error messages in every language that Internet Explorer has ever been deployed in.
No way.
So you have to be able to deduplicate across languages, which is a fun little experiment in data science and machine learning.
Wow. That's interesting. Internet Explorer, huh? Wild.
We're very happy it doesn't exist anymore. So I think we're kind of coming towards 2017 is when Sosta was acquired by Akamai. That's when we ended up here. Uh, we added server timing because now being part of a CDN meant you could actually control some of the headers that were sent from the server as well. And so we added server timing in order to measure some things like whether a resource was served from cache or not, whether you went back to the origin, how much time it took from the origin, etc. And we also added user timing so that customers could measure their own in-page events and kind of set their own custom timers on that. And at this point, I'd say we started working on in-page events. So spas were good enough for when a user interacts with the page and it actually makes a network request. But what about interactions that don't make network requests? Are they sluggish? Are they fast? Can we figure out those things? Can we figure out frame rate? Can we figure out total blocking time? Can we look at long animation frames and all those kinds of things that there were new APIs coming out, and we started adding support for that. So that's kind of what we've been doing over the last couple of years, is essentially looking at these in-page events, the entire lifetime of a page, rather than just page load or the single page load as individual events. And that makes for more, let's think, a holistic view of the user experience. We brought in things like rage clicking,
Mhm.
which again is interesting. I think there's some fun things I have. So I'll switch to another slide right now. This one where this was a while ago. I don't know if you remember, but the Winter Olympics a few years ago, where the U.S. and Canada women's team were playing hockey,
Mhm.
and we just so happened to be measuring performance data and rage clicks and LD50 and all of that during this game. So it was very interesting to sort of correlate the performance data with actual events happening in the game, like when different goals were scored, and splitting that data by country to see what users from different parts from the US versus Canada were doing with the game, and when was rage clicking going up, when was refreshes going up, when were JavaScript errors going up, etc. Or what were users' tolerance to JavaScript errors, the tolerance to bad performance, how that was changing. It was very interesting data to look at. So these are some of the fun things we get to do with collecting RAM data for live events and sort of analyzing that in real time. I think that's always been the fun part of the job. After you've broken your head to fight with browser APIs for a while, you get to reap the benefits from that.
Absolutely. This is super interesting. And you have overtime, penalties.
Yeah. I'd say that an interesting note about this is I didn't know how hockey worked before I did this. So what you're seeing here is that there's a little overlay of the performance data and the games.
Yes.
You see the performance data shows that the users are responding before something happened in the game, or something like that. And the thing is, I didn't account for stoppage time and breaks between quarters and stuff. So my data was not exactly one to one. And if I didn't account for that, then they would line up exactly, and users would be reacting to things rather than predicting things happening in the game. So I thought that was interesting, that I had to go learn about hockey in order to analyze this data correctly, and step a little bit outside my domain of expertise.
Which is great, but I love the idea of looking at this kind of data and making these correlations, because again, especially in this sort of like modern space and time where, I personally think, the sort of like the the sports experience now is very much tied to, devices.
Yeah,
People they look at data, stats, whatever it is, real time. And, this is bound to, come up in terms of like the amount of data that you can sort of collect and, again, make these kind of correlations. But I think this is fantastic. Like I remember a long time ago, not to steer off course, but I did this blog post, uh, talking about the NCAA basketball tournament, you know, and how big of a deal that was. And, and looking at some data, I was, I helped, I got some help from, who was I sort of like writing this blog post, and he looked at some of my stats. Anyways, it'll come back to me. But yeah, I was super interested because I know what it is to watch like modern sports now, because it is tightly sort of, coupled to devices and people looking at information.
yeah, yep, exactly. And I think this is one example. There have been other things. We've looked at how screen size changes over holiday weekends, for example.
Mhm,
As you when people have moved from their offices to their parents' homes, for example,
mhm,
they use different size devices and different network connection types. Uh,
mhm.
It's always fun to see how the tolerance for performance changes when you're in different states, when you're in the weekend versus when you're uh, out during the week.
Yeah.
Uh, those are just fun things we can look at.
And this is obviously, again, folks, we've been talking about a lot of details here, but ultimately, this is the idea of like RUM data, real user monitoring, like what is going on, like making updates to a library like Boomerang, because there are opportunities to really refine the data now and to get a better snapshot of what it's like to use device X in territory Y under condition Z, right? And it's fascinating. I know we've not talked about this yet, and I'd love to sort of get some clarity here from you. It went from round trip to Boomerang, and Boomerang through log normal, Boomerang at Sosta. Where does impulse come into the conversation?
Yeah, Impulse is definitely the commercial server-side component of Boomerang. So Boomerang itself, like I said, is a beaconing library. It's JavaScript. It's open source under the BSD license. Anyone can take it. A lot of people have forked it for their own use.
Mhm.
I think Shopify used to be one of the big users. I don't know if they still use it. There are other companies. HubSpot, for example, had their own version. Salesforce had their own version. Um, and you can do anything with it. You can send beacons back to your own server. You can send beacons to Google Analytics. People have blogged how to send beacons to Matomo Analytics to write data directly to CouchDB from
Mhm.
Boomerang. So there are all these possibilities. But for most companies, they don't want to set up the infrastructure to do that themselves. They want someone who'll offer a service that's end to end. And so that's where Impulse comes in. It's really the end to end service where you don't do much more than say, I want Impulse. And we will, through the Akamai CDN, put Boomerang onto your page, set it up to send data back to Impulse, collect that data, make dashboards for you, uh, tie you up with professional services who can do data science on the data that's collected and all that sort of stuff. You get the whole package for a little money.
So it's basically Boomerang in a box.
Um, yeah, sort of that. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Like, yeah, I'm just sort of, going back to the souders in the box,
Yeah.
which again, I laughed so much when Tammy mentioned that, because I understood what that meant. So, but awesome. So, uh, and something else that I saw on your slide, which was, in 2012, you and Buddy Brewer, by the way, really started to talk about the business metrics, which I think are important to sort of discuss, because today in 2025, this is definitely the dominant conversation. Speaking with Shopify, speaking with Mike, what am I talking about? Eric Vitt last week. It was heavily, business, e-com centered, and everyone else at some point that mentions it. So it was this essentially, like you mentioned, like the first time that someone was connecting the dots, literally.
Um, I'd say with the business metrics, it was very much we were working with e-commerce companies early in the day, and the question was, why should I care about performance?
Mm,
Uh, I can make my site fast, but why should I care? Why should I use your product? Why should I spend money on it? Right?
mhm,
If I had to put one developer, two developers into a perf team, how can I justify spending that, whether it's $100,000, $200,000 a year on engineers working exclusively on performance? So that's where it came down to: can we show them that this performance actually is making an impact on their bottom line? That spending that $200,000 on improving performance will get them a multiple of that back in terms of revenue. And that's kind of where we introduce the business metrics, starting just with simple things like bounce rate. But then, if as a customer got more comfortable with us, they were willing to tell us about their conversion metrics or point us to their Google Analytics metrics, we could pull that data out of the page and say, "Hey, we can tell you exactly what your dollar value is for every conversion, or for every millisecond or every 100 milliseconds that your page is loading." And we've seen a lot of studies since then, so I won't go into that
Yeah.
about how business and performance is correlated. Let's say every site was different, right?
Mhm.
It doesn't work for everyone. There are some sites which are so exclusive, like a customer cannot get the same product anywhere else, and those customers will tolerate any amount of performance degradation on those sites, simply because that's the only place they can go for it. But there are sites where you have a choice. You can go to any of 4 or 5 sites to get a product. Those are the places where performance really matters.
Mhm.
We looked at other kinds of sites. We looked at a gaming site, for example, and the initial page load, nobody really cares about, because after the page is loaded, they're spending about 2 hours playing a game in JavaScript or in Flash or something. And so performance does not matter to an extent. Right? If the page isn't loading, that's something that's different. But they do care about other things like, what's the performance of my checkout page? Can
Mhm.
I actually sell tokens in this game and things? So that's where performance and business metrics do come together for a lot of different sites.
Absolutely. And, again, you mentioned the impulse product and what it is ultimately. There's certainly a bit of that around where people, uh, engineers who are well versed are able to create a product based on the idea that people are not trying to build their own teams, you know, and they want something, again, souders in a box. And they just want to get the information. Um, and I know I had a million questions, but there's this one. I think we touched on it very quickly, but as we look at the public release in 2010 and we are in 2025, how significant and how important has been the evolution of the browser for Boomerang?
Yeah, I'd say the evolution of the browser has kind of made it easier to collect a lot of the data. So way back when we released, we had to attach to the unload event and the before unload event and the onload event, and a whole bunch of things on the page, and we had these 10 different ways of sending beacons. Right, you use an invisible image, make a GET request through that, sending all the data on a query string. But if it was too large, you'd have to do a submit a form to a hidden iframe. And if that didn't work, because that actually affects the window history in Internet Explorer, you'd have to use XHR. Uh, then browsers came up with the send beacon and with fetch later and all of that. So we can delete all of that old code. Right? That's sending beacons through these many different ways and just support the most recent ways of sending beacons. We can uh, we can collect more interesting data. So then the core web vitals that are now easily available through browsers no longer require hacks. Once sparse support in browsers sort of becomes first class, we can get rid of our own sparse support using mutation observers and start using the browser's native spar. So it mainly means reducing the size of Boomerang, but there's always going to be other things to do with that data. Right? Can we correlate events on the page? Can we tie certain events to certain JavaScript errors that happened? There are pages are different no matter what the APIs might do. The browsers might be the same, but the pages are still going to be different. And we need to stop
Mhm.
all kinds of pages, all kinds of users from different network connection types, different parts of the world, different usability devices, and we need to be able to measure that and give our customers an idea of, right, who's uh, who's being affected by the performance of their page, who's being affected by the usability of their pages.
I'm going to ask you, a question that I've asked, I think, 2 to 3 guests, in the last month, say. Um, so we know in particular that, say, in the last year. Now, I think I'm basing this off I think, maybe a tweet or something like that, or a post, anyways, from, I think it was someone at Vercel, and they mentioned that, I think it was like almost 80% of their traffic was coming from, in a particular situation, like I don't know the full details, but at one point they just mentioned that they had a significant amount of like referral traffic come from ChatGPT. Now, in the last bit, a few months, several months, I'm not sure, but a lot of these AI companies have mentioned the idea of launching their own browser.
Mhm.
And, you know, browsers, we tend to know what the market share is like. But I mentioned this simply because we have seen the adoption rate of, say, you know, ChatGPT to be pretty significant in terms of just like the size and quickness. Now, if and when they launch a browser out to the public, widely available, and you see like a lot of adoption, how would that affect something like Boomerang?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So what I've seen so far with the traffic generated by AI agents is largely on content, right? It's summarizing content and providing information on read heavy sites.
Hmm.
So a place where you can get information, correlate all of that, combine it, and provide it in small, maybe sometimes correct summaries, right? But what happens when you want to do research on multiple products? And we see this happening a lot in terms of customer sites. Is users will visit and they'll go through a checkout funnel, but they won't actually check out
Hmm.
because what they're largely doing for and might sometimes it might go on for days or weeks
Hmm.
is they're comparing products. They're adding a product to their cart,
Hmm.
or they're looking at the product page. They're looking at the reviews. They're comparing products and stuff, and eventually they're going to decide on a product and add it to their carts and then check out.
Hmm.
That kind of flow is still going to exist, and
Hmm.
um, we might move to a point where the AI agents can do the summarization or the comparisons for you.
Hmm.
At some point, w- I'd say sites are also improving the experience they provide with these
Hmm.
things. Like you can try out an outfit, for example. You
Hmm.
want to buy a hat or you want to buy a shirt. You can take a picture of yourself and see what it looks like on you
Hmm.
before buying that. And those kinds of things are still worked through a traditional browser with users visiting the site themselves. So Boomerang is still going to be measuring that. It makes no sense for Boomerang to measure the experience of a chat GPT because it's not a real user.
Yeah.
So we do actively filter out synthetic users.
Hmm.
So we collect that data, but we tag that separately so that we can compare the performance experienced by real users with synthetic users.
Yeah.
M- yeah, I'd say eventually the end user experience is still always going to matter.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree, and I asked for a couple of reasons. So I think OpenAI Day happened maybe about 2 weeks ago now, but between a week and 2 weeks ago, and they talked about, um, like Shopify is talking about some kind of weird integration. I'm not sure what the details are, but it was along those lines. I was also thinking about it because you had mentioned that Boomerang at current is less about like actual timing, measurements, and more like in-page experiences and whatnot. And so I'm curious to see what the next browser in-page experience is like when they come around. And I'm going to do a little bit of research myself. I know an engineer I know, she has a talk that I need to watch. I think it's called like The End of the Browser. I don't know, something along those lines. I don't say it's doom and gloom, but it made me think about that. And with the recent sort of like rush to create some kind of like agentic experience in the browser. Like, what does that mean for something like Boomerang, or just, you know, timing measurements in general, like you mentioned, the core web vitals, et cetera, et cetera. So I just thought that would be an interesting idea. And again, what does it mean for this end of uh, performance measurements, right?
Yeah.
So you'd mentioned quickly that, the current priority for yourself and Boomerang is sort of like dealing with the in-page experience more. Is this for the foreseeable future, or is there something, that you potentially could be working on um, that's outside of that?
No, yeah, I definitely say looking at long animation frames, looking at attribution, trying to find root causes of performance degradations, uh, root causes of JavaScript errors as well. Those are things that we've been collecting for a while, and it's really good to try and get deeper into that kind of information.
And oh, you just said something. It sparked the memory, and I just forgot. Boomerang, boomerang, boomerang. Have you seen? And again, with this idea of rum now, people are really comfortable, understanding what it is, what it means, and how important it is. Have you seen any recent forks that sort of like, sparked your curiosity? You're like, oh, let me follow this because this sounds interesting.
No, and I won't say anything recent. The biggest fork was probably Salesforce when they created Kylie. So Kylie is a type of a boomerang in Australia, and I don't know if they still use it. At the time, there was um, they wanted a lot of more standard JavaScript. They wanted to be able to pass it through Clojure compiler and stuff, and we couldn't do that because of older browser support. And I think by the time we got to a stage where we could drop that support and really be able to use strict in our code, they had split too far apart from us to make any useful contributions.
Ah,
Mm.
I got it. I got it.
That was definitely an interesting one. Uh, I know HubSpot had another version of that. Um, yeah, I can't think of anything recent that I've been looking at.
But basically, the fork was Boomerang was unrecognizable.
Yeah, yeah,
I got you. I got you. Um, Man, Philip, this was absolutely amazing. And I do want to say one more thing is I remember when I would spend all my weekends and sometimes evenings, but weekends for sure, just like reading a lot of like the O'Reilly documentation and books and whatnot. And I thought I had my idea of what perf was and et cetera. And you would always like chime in and be like, "What about the rum?" I'm like, "What about the rum?" And I don't think I got it then because I just never saw it in a lot of the books, or at least I feel like it never came up a lot because I know I would have been digging to find out what was going on. But I remember when it did click like years later, I'm like, "Oh, I totally get it." Um, but it was always interesting because you would always like pop out of nowhere, and I'd be like, "Yeah, rum. Like, what's up with rum?" You know. This is quite some time back, by the way, but still. So I just wanted to acknowledge that I didn't know what the hell was going on. And but it's been a fun journey seeing all that and really understanding what how important rum is, so, and especially like I said, in the last 2 3 years you've seen that conversation being sort of really much more prominent now to make sure that people understood what was going on between synthetic and what you guys have been doing. So thank you very much for that. I feel like this was part history lesson, which was important, but also part, an exposure to, how, rum was built, how important it was, and, what was going on early on and the challenges that were there to make, Boomerang work properly
yeah.
and ideally to what it's become right now.
We have
So,
a question in the chat from Stoyan.
oh, Stoyan's there. Of course, I wasn't looking. Oh, there he is. Hello, folks. I'm watching.
For anyone who doesn't know Stoyan, he is also one of the early members of the exceptional performance team at Yahoo.
Yeah,
He worked on YSlow a lot. He was the lead developer on that after Steve quit.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Oh, he was the lead on that.
yeah, I mean, he
Okay.
worked on other things like Smush It,
Yes, I remember
uh,
that.
when Nicole Sullivan was also on the exceptional performance team, worked on Smush It together.
Which
So
I
he
didn't realize. You know.
there's a question about whether Buddy or I invented the RUM acronym, and no, we did not invent it. It sort of, I think it organically evolved through the community. It was never our intention to call it RUM, but we definitely embraced it.
Hey, it's perfect. It's one syllable. It makes sense, and that like you can't fault that. So, by the way, Stoyan, we need to get on a call. I actually pinged him about Slow because I wanted him to come on about that, but I think he was like somewhere in Europe,
Mm.
and enjoying a bottle of wine with his family. So I told him once he's back, we'll have to get on a call to get him on because I did definitely want to talk about Slow at that point. Okay, Mr. Tellis, if someone has been fascinated about this, wants to talk about Boomerang, is thinking about forking it, how do they get in touch? Even though I think you mentioned it earlier, but let's rehash that.
Yeah, definitely get in touch with me, Boomerang, on Blue Sky, on LinkedIn, on GitHub, and you will also find the Boomerang on GitHub.
Mhm.
It's github.com/akamai/boomerang. And yeah, those are all good places to reach me.
And obviously that's under Blues Moon. What's the deal with that name, by the way?
Oh, that name is it's very old. It's when I started using IRC in the 90s, and yeah, it's just a bluesy version of the tune Blue Moon. I don't know if
Okay.
you've heard Blue Moon, but yeah, I liked that. I liked to play the blues back then, so
Oh,
that's
okay, okay.
where it came from.
I get it now. Again, something else that I always meant to ask to figure out what it was all about. Let me see if I could do this. Oh, it's all good. All right, folks. Um, That was fantastic. I know a little bit of history, but that's dear to me. I love to see and hear how things were pretty much built and the things that happen along the way. And I definitely heard a few nuggets that I wasn't aware of. I'm hoping that you did as well. What I'm going to do is always, I'm going to have this edited, cut up. I'm going to get some nice little clips out of this, which is going to be awesome. You'll be able to sort of like consume it that way as well. But as I mentioned, I should have this up and ready next week for next week's episode, and which I'll talk about right now. I'm actually going to have a coworker, actually two coworkers of Philip's, come on, but we're going to talk about rum again, believe it or not. I think we're going to talk about the rum archive, what they've done this year. They've made some additions as well. For those who don't know, the rum archive is kind of like our HP archive, but rum data. And this is through the Akamai networks, something that they started about 3 years ago. And I think we're roughly around the 3-year anniversary because they launched that over at Perf Now 3 years ago, I believe. So yeah, I'll have the episode then, and that's actually going to be happening, I believe, just to accommodate schedules. I think I'm going to do it on the Friday, which is if today's the 15th, the 22nd, so it's going to be the 24th. So it's going to be Nick Jasma, and we're actually going to bring on, per his request, we're going to have Robin Marks on as well because he also has been working on um, Rum Archive. So yes, that's that. That's it. Any final words, Mr. Tellis, as we part ways and as we part ways with our audience as well?
All right. I think it's always interesting to understand what your users are doing. Definitely, you want to collect data, you want to measure it, you don't want to trust it, you want to verify it.
True, true.
But yeah, don't make decisions without data.
Absolutely. And that's something that Eric Vitt said last week. They're extremely data driven. So I certainly do appreciate that. And I'm sure other engineers do as well. All right. You, sir, do not go anywhere. I'm going to speak to you just in closing in the green room, as we like to call it. And folks, thank you very much for joining us. And we will catch you next week. And I'll make the announcement either later on today or first thing tomorrow morning. Thank you very much for your time. And again, look forward to that video being up and ready next week. Cheers.